So, now that I'm done talking about an early 2013 game that was so negatively received it caused the franchise to disappear for the better part of a decade, I'm going to talk about that other early 2013 game that was so negatively received it caused the franchise to disappear for the better part of a decade. I can't catch a break, can I? Devil May Cry 4 was an interesting situation for Capcom, because despite becoming the best-selling game in the series, selling over 3 million copies, that did not satisfy Capcom, who were hoping for bigger numbers after opening up the series to Xbox. The game also received very lukewarm reception. Despite containing the deepest and most complex mechanics in its genre, entertaining characters, and an awesome soundtrack, many criticized the lack of content, reused content, and mixed enemy design. It's been commonly accepted that this was because the game was rushed to reach a deadline, and as such, the developers had to make do with what they had, putting out a solid product, but a very flawed one, especially when compared to the complete package of Devil May Cry 3. Capcom wrongly attributed this to Devil May Cry not appealing to Western audiences, and thus it was decided that Devil May Cry would be rebooted with a style and atmosphere that was more Western inspired. Ninja Theory was chosen as the developers for the reboot due to their previous experience in making action games and them being major fans of the series, which I know some people may find hard to believe, but I'll get to that. Initially, Ninja Theory planned on making a reboot that was very faithful to the original games, and this is reflected in many of the early design concepts for Dante. For the most part, it's his Devil May Cry 1 design, but with a bit more edge. However, Capcom really pushed for a more Western direction, and thus this was dropped. This caused Ninja Theory to work through many different iterations of Dante, inspired by many popular Western characters and tropes, and some of these designs are pretty awesome. Look at this Hellboy-inspired one. That would have been a cool take on Dante. But unfortunately, we would get possibly the worst case scenario. At Tokyo Game Show 2010, just 2 years after the release of Devil May Cry 4, this was the first look at the new Dante.
Dante.
And people were not impressed. Many people gave constructive criticism about this new take, saying that it was a very unnecessary change to a beloved character and series, and of course others went to attacking the developers personally. In general, the reception to this new take on Devil May Cry was negatively received. People weren't a fan of the darker, edgier, punk-inspired setting of the reboot, especially when you consider the gothic yet light-hearted tone of the original games. This was a serious deviation from what fans knew and loved, and it got so much pushback as a result. It does make sense after all. A series that you're a fan of is being completely restarted, and it does not resemble the series that you fell in love with at all. But I don't think Capcom or Ninja Theory quite expected the backlash they received. They certainly didn't help themselves though, as they responded to the backlash with condescending comments, and insulting the original games to make the new ones seem better. I always find it idiotic when developers do this. I get fans can be very difficult to deal with and please, but what type of response do you think you're going to get when you say stuff like this? You could just say something harmless such as, "We get the backlash, but please wait until the game comes out before making full judgment." Attacking the fans and the series that you're rebooting is not going to end well. And this would continue for years with a constant back and forth between the fans and Ninja Theory. They never quite found equal footing with each other, and thus, whenever the game was marketed, it was always met with extreme skepticism. Speaking of the marketing, it's absolutely dreadful. The interviews with the cast and crew seem to be edited in such a seizure-inducing way.
My name's Louis Herthman. I'm playing Mundus in Devil May Cry. Mundus is a god, immortal, but the way he comes across to us is like a very powerful banker or one of these Wall Street guys. A piece of shit.
Also, for some reason, the CGI trailer features a different voice actor for Dante.
My name is Dante. Tell them I'm coming.
The game finally released in January 2013, and whilst it received mostly positive reviews from critics, the fans had made up their mind, trashed the entire game on many websites. That's not to say nobody had fair criticism. There is plenty to criticize about this game, but the loudest group was the dedicated haters. People would go onto Metacritic and rate this game as 0 out of 10, which is pretty funny. The interesting part, though, is that the game ended up selling worse than Devil May Cry 4, the game that apparently sold bad enough to warrant a reboot. The game also sold terribly in Japan, so the series not only lost its Western audience, but its Japanese audience back home too. The game did get re-released in 2015 on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 with the Definitive Edition, which not only remastered the game, but also made many gameplay changes to make the game play better, which I will be talking about when applicable. That's the last we'd ever hear from the reboot, as the original Devil May Cry returned in 2019 with Devil May Cry 5, which became the best-selling game in the series, even entering Capcom's top 10 for a short while, and it received universal acclaim and won many awards, such as the Best Action Game of 2019 at the Game Awards. Which is odd because Sekiro won Game of the Year, and that's also an action game, so whatever. All of this means that DmC Devil May Cry is a failed reboot. It did not achieve what it set out to do, which was restart the franchise. However, that doesn't immediately mean that the game is completely worthless or doesn't do anything right. Which is why I've been interested in covering this game, as I've had many mixed feelings on it for years. So join me on this journey for the most divisive Devil May Cry. To start off with, DmC Devil May Cry. Okay, quick note. What's with the little M? Why is the full title of the game Devil May Cry, Devil May Cry? From now on, I'm just going to call it DmC. Anyway, DmC shares a lot of aspects with previous entries in the series. It's a game that has a heavy focus on delay combos, a style meter that gives you more points for switching up moves and avoiding damage, and it has enemy juggling, of course. The control scheme is actually very similar to DMC4's Dante, so if you've played the previous games, then you can pick this entry up rather easily. So let's start with the weapons. Y or triangle is the attack button that swings Rebellion, and you can also use a different combo if you delay the inputs. Rebellion's combos have also been tweaked to work better for crowd control in the midst of combat, as they have a larger hitbox and the sword swings completely around Dante, which is helpful for any enemies to the sides or behind you. Apart from that, the rest of Rebellion's moveset is similar to previous entries. You can launch enemies up into the air, and you have options for either staying on the ground or launching up with the enemy. You also have a ground slam attack for the sword. Stinger also returns, which mechanically works similar to previous entries, but it has a different input, which I'll get into later. Apart from that, the biggest difference to Rebellion is how it works whilst in the air. In previous games, pressing the attack button whilst in the air will cause Dante to do the ground slam attack, Helmbreaker. It wasn't until Devil May Cry 3 where the style system was introduced and the Swordmaster style allowed you to combo with Rebellion in the air. This was a bit of a pain in DmC 3 since you could only have one style equipped at a time, locking you out of other movesets and combat options, but Devil May Cry 4 fixed this by allowing you to switch styles mid-combat. However, in DmC there is no style system. All of the moves are baked into Dante, so instead, pressing Y or triangle whilst in the air is what allows you to do air combos, and pressing B or circle is what does the ground slam. It seems as if the idea was to take aspects of Nero's Red Queen moveset from DMC4 and incorporate them into Dante's Rebellion moveset. Red Queen has a bigger focus on crowd control than Rebellion, and since Nero has no style system, you air combo using the standard attack button. It does surprisingly work quite well at streamlining the inputs whilst giving the same general result, but the problem in cutting out Swordmaster is that it ends up limiting the moves you can perform with Rebellion, as the combined moveset of Rebellion in DMC is 11 moves, whereas in DMC4 it's 14. Round Trip is absent and its utility was given to Aquila, Prop and Shredder is absent and instead were given to Osiris, and Dance Macabre is completely gone. Therefore, even though Rebellion controls well, it has less utility compared to Devil May Cry 4's Rebellion. The first weapon you obtain after Rebellion is Arbiter. This weapon is actually fairly unique compared to other weapons in the series. It's a giant axe that has massive wind-ups to each hit, but when the hits do land, the impact is like a freight train, usually knocking enemies back and delivering massive damage. It can also send out projectiles, so it does have some range use as well. Plus it has a ground slam attack that launches enemies into the air. It can even break hyper armor easily, but is risky to do so. It's a welcome addition to the series, giving a weapon that can still pack a punch and have other smaller uses, while still providing weaknesses to using such a tool. Osiris is a scythe that prioritizes crowd control and air utility over raw power. It's great for stunning a crowd of enemies and keeping them in the air, and it does look pretty cool when you do so. The problem is that when in the air, it performs almost the exact same as Rebellion with two combos. One of them pushes the enemy away, and the other pushes them up and gives you a slight bit of altitude. The only real difference is the hitbox and damage. What this means is that when you get Osiris, there's not really much reason to use Rebellion's air attacks other than for damage, which you could supplement with demonic weapons which do more damage than Rebellion anyway. It's not broken or badly designed, I just wish the air attacks were more unique so that the weapon had more interesting utilities for combat. Otherwise, it's still extremely useful in a crowd of enemies to give Dante breathing room. It's great for enemy juggling, and the more you use it, the more damage it does. It's a very good weapon overall, I just think the air moveset could have been tweaked. The next weapon the player receives is Eric's. Devil May Cry games have always had punching weapons, except for Devil May Cry 2, and Eric's is this game's version. It shares a lot in common with DMC4's Gilgamesh, as it's a fast weapon that packs more of a punch if you charge the attacks first, with there being 2 charge levels. However, the weapon is severely limited by only being a punch weapon and not a kick weapon like the other entries. Which means any moveset Dante had with his feet in previous games is completely gone in DMC. This means that Full House is gone, Kick 13 is gone, and Flush, which causes damage just by jumping next to enemies, is also gone, leaving Eric's with 8 attacks compared to Gilgamesh's 13. Whilst useful for dealing damage and can be used as both a slow damaging weapon or a quick stun weapon, the point is that it still has less versatility than its previous incarnation. I really don't see any benefits from making Eric's a punch-only weapon. It only limits how useful it could be. Aquila is a weapon that sort of behaves like Lucifer in Devil May Cry 4. When you attack an enemy, it sticks a blade into them, and then you can call those enemies back at any time. If you do this with a group of enemies, you can call them back and perform a massive AoE attack to damage everyone in the area. It's also useful for crowd control, and allows you to shish kebab enemies in the air and group them together for damaging attacks. It doesn't do much damage itself, so it's more of a utility than it is an actual weapon, but it still has a fair place in the combat system. In terms of guns, Ebony and Ivory are similar to their previous versions, and they include Rainstorm, as well as a new Reverse Rainstorm. But they're also missing Twosome Time and Honeycomb Fire. So once again, they're a downgrade. Revenant is this game's shotgun, and it does play very similar to the previous games. It even features fireworks, but it's also missing Gunstinger and Backslide, so again, it's a downgrade. The only real new gun is Kablooey, which I love the name of. It's like Lucifer in that you fire explosive darts that you can detonate at any time, and it does allow for repositioning enemies, but not to the extent Lucifer offered, with a full moveset of options for the darts that also allowed the darts to float in the air. If you got good enough with Lucifer, you could control where any enemy in the game was at any given time. You don't really have that luxury with Kablooey. So overall, the weapons in DmC are good. They each have different uses, some are more practical for certain situations and enemies than others, and when combined with other weapons, they can have damaging effects on the enemies, and it ultimately makes the combat pretty satisfying to partake in. Plus, separating the weapons into categories makes it easier to gauge their strengths. Demonic weapons are heavy-hitting, slower weapons more focused on ground combat and singular enemies, whereas angelic weapons do less damage but make up for it with air combo potential and crowd control. Rebellion sort of acting as an in-between for both. This game also has a really cool feature that none of the other games have, not even DmC 5, and that being weapon switch combos. Basically, if you start a combo with Rebellion and then switch to another weapon mid-combo, then you get a completely different combo than you would have gotten if you just used one of the weapons. This is a great way to encourage multitasking weapons and provides even more utility to switching weapons on the fly, as they function as actual companion pieces as opposed to purely separate weapons. I actually wish they took this feature into Devil May Cry 5, but maybe I'm asking for a bit too much. Plus, it is more convenient to switch between weapons here than it is in Devil May Cry 4 or even 5. Instead of pressing the triggers to swap between 3 or 4 different weapons, holding the right trigger allows you to access demon weapons, whilst holding the left trigger allows you to access angelic weapons. You switch between demonic and angelic weapons using the D-pad, which does make it fairly easy to juggle 5 weapons on the fly. However, being easier and more convenient isn't always a good thing if you're sacrificing aspects to achieve that goal. In making weapon switching easier to manage, the game has had to sacrifice the style system to achieve that, which in turn means that a lot of useful moves that Swordmaster brought to the table had to either be cut entirely or moved to other weapons. But it's not just Swordmaster affected. Royal Guard, a useful block and parry mechanic that can unleash devastating damage to enemies whilst negating damage done to Dante, is completely absent, as well as Trickster, which allows you to dodge and teleport. There is 2 dedicated dodge buttons, but there's no teleport. The game does try to compensate by taking some of the moves from Swordmaster and baking them into the weapons themselves, but you still end up with overlapping movesets or cut movesets, meaning that the combat in DmC doesn't have as much variety or versatility as Devil May Cry 4 or even 3. In DmC, you do have 5 weapons at once, but the angelic weapons steal some movesets from Rebellion anyway, so you're having to spread the complete moveset of a weapon across 3 other weapons just to make the controls more convenient, which in turn just makes those weapons less unique because they're leeching off of Rebellion. In fact, I said 11 moves, but one of those is combining attacks with other weapons, so it's more like 10. And that's ignoring the other weapon slot in DmC 3, which can give you anywhere from 10 to 15 additional moves depending on the weapon. In DmC, you would need to combine the movesets of 3 weapons to get as many movesets and as much versatility as 2 weapons in DmC 3. Same with DmC 4. Essentially, DmC has lowered the skill floor and has made DmC easier to pick up and play, but it's also lowered the skill ceiling by removing core movesets and limiting the utilities and usefulness of each weapon it has. Sure, it allows you to use 5 weapons on the go, but 1 weapon in DmC 3 or 4 can offer more than 2 in DmC can. And even if we ignore the weapon movesets, it also wasn't worth removing the functionality of the other styles, which means that this game would still have less depth and variety of playstyles when compared to the last 2 games. The game also made the brilliant idea to remove lock-on, which was useful for directional inputs in previous games as well as choosing which enemy to focus on. This means that directional inputs in this game are clunky to pull off and it's not really worth doing. For example, in the previous games, to pull off Stinger you would lock onto the enemy, push forward and then press attack, and then Dante would perform the Stinger move. In this game, you have to move the stick in the direction twice for him to do Stinger, which is a very clunky and unreliable input to do. What this also means is that sometimes the game will attack an enemy you didn't want it to because there's no way of the game really knowing which enemy you want to focus on. Even in Bayonetta, which Hideki Kamiya said was designed in a way so that you could play without lock-on, still featured lock-on. There's 2 dodge buttons in this game that both behave the exact same way. You could remove one and add a lock-on button without sacrificing the dodge mechanic. And thank goodness they added lock-on in the definitive edition, and the game plays so much better with it. It also helps tell the player how much health a particular enemy has or how much damage they're doing to it. So it's another reason not to remove it. In general, the combat system does still have a lot of depth and variety, especially when compared to other Western hack-and-slash character action games, but it still falls short of the number of options and variety of playstyles that Devil May Cry 3 and 4 offered. In regards to enemy design, Devil May Cry has always suffered in this regard. The games do feature a lot of good enemies that pose a good challenge, but will then feature just as many that are tedious to fight because of either their moveset is irritating to deal with, their hitbox is bizarre, or there's pretty much only one good way to deal with them, or they're just a very gimmicky enemy. The games have also never gotten enemy aggression done well. The enemies are either way too docile, like in Devil May Cry 2 and 5, or they're so hyperactive in Devil May Cry 4 that the average player won't really get a chance to use some of the more interesting moves or mechanics. Or you have a situation like Devil May Cry 3 where most of the enemies are very gimmicky and add nothing to the gameplay loop other than boredom. I still find it funny how all these years later, Devil May Cry 1 still has the best enemy design in the series. So how does DmC fare? Well, pretty well to be honest in this regard, but it suffers from the same balancing issues as other games in the series. I think this game does a pretty good job in terms of enemy aggression, at least on higher difficulties. Enemies are much more aggressive, but it's also very easy to bail out of bad situations and stun base enemies, so if you get yourself in a bad spot, then it's probably your fault. The hitboxes are also mostly solid. The animations of the enemies do a good job at giving the player an idea of the timing and direction of attacks, as well as the general area of effect. I don't remember ever having a situation where I got attacked, despite the graphics showing otherwise, so attacks from enemies are reliable, consistent, and have a pattern that the player can learn from, whilst also being easy to combo and show off. You of course have bigger enemies that are much harder to stun and gain some hyper armor for a limited period, but there are still ways to break them out of this state if you learn how to use the weapons correctly. Some enemies have weak spots where the player can perform massive damage, but these are usually the spots where the player is also the most vulnerable, and as such adds a risk versus reward situation to combat, where you have to actively put yourself in harm's way to fight the enemies better. There's also enemies such as Dreamrunner and Drekavac, which are much more resistant to your attacks and require good dodging and timing to deal damage to. It puts you on the defensive whenever they show up, but it still allows you to go crazy if you're good enough. Overall, the enemy design is pretty solid actually, but there's one aspect I haven't mentioned. Color-coded enemies. Throughout DmC, you'll encounter red and blue enemies. Red enemies can only be damaged by demonic weapons, whereas blue enemies can only be damaged by angelic weapons. Now this wouldn't be too bad in of itself, I mean it still limits the player's options, but the game is trying to encourage the player to switch weapons often, even though the unique utilities of each weapon should be enough motivation, but sure. The problem is that any incorrect attack will bounce off of the enemy. This makes it annoying when you're fighting multiple enemies at once, only for your combo to be interrupted because you were using the wrong weapon or a color-coded enemy got caught in the crossfire. Thankfully, this was addressed in the Definitive Edition, where you can attack enemies with the incorrect weapon, you just can't stun them with the incorrect weapon. So overall, the enemy design is fairly solid, but one of my main problems, as I said before, is the balancing of these games, and especially the Dante Must Die difficulty. A lot of games seem to think that by giving the enemy absurd HP numbers, that it somehow makes the game more challenging, but it really doesn't. It only makes the enemies more tedious to fight and makes battles last for an eternity. Dante Must Die not only does this, but gives the enemies Devil Trigger, which greatly reduces the amount of damage they take and makes them much harder to stun. Once again, this just makes the game tedious because instead of actually engaging with the mechanics, I'm encouraged to spam the nuclear damage moves, since they give the most style points and they deal the most damage. So fights stop being this dance with the enemy, and instead it just ends up being me mixing between a list of overpowered moves to get through encounters, because why would I use any of the weaker moves? They'll do very little damage and they won't stun the enemy. At least in this game, however, if you manage to parry an enemy's attack, then it disables their Devil Trigger. So there is a way to deal with it, but the inclusion of the mechanic to begin with just ends up making the game a chore to play on Dante Must Die, because the fights will go on forever if I want to play the game in a fun way. Here's a note to developers out there: make your game harder by increasing enemy aggression, speed, and damage, not by severely limiting the player's options. That's not how you do good enemy design, or balancing. Probably the most disappointing aspect of the gameplay to me is the boss design. Previous Devil May Cry games all had a variety of different boss types, whether it be a giant enemy with massively telegraphed attacks that deal heavy damage, spectacle bosses that have rather simplistic mechanics but make up for it in crazy visuals or a soundtrack, speed bosses that are very quick and as such test your timing with attacks and evades. Some bosses focus more on physical attacks, which adds a risk versus reward fighting style for the player, but some others focus on projectile and range. There's also rival fighters, who are meant to have a similar moveset to the players but is different in a way that complements it. Not every boss in these games are good, there are a few stinkers, but the developers have always understood that bosses are meant to provide different challenges for the player to not only make them stand out from one another, but to test the player's skills in a variety of situations. Something Ninja Theory clearly doesn't understand. There are 6 bosses in DmC, and with the exception of the final boss, they all fit into the category of giant enemy with massively telegraphed attacks that deal heavy damage. This is a problem because it makes the design of the bosses repetitive, and it means that the bosses are never testing new challenges on the player. It also means that every boss has the exact same strategy to beat it. The succubus requires you to dodge its big arms and hit a weak spot on its head, which is the same style of design as Mundus's spawn. In both bosses as well, you have to jump to the side and then use your hook to expose the boss's weakness. The only thing stopping this from being the exact same boss fight is that Mundus' spawn is mobile whilst the succubus is stationary. But even then, the spawn doesn't move much, so this doesn't really have an effect on gameplay. The hunter plays extremely similar to Mundus' spawn with a very similar moveset, and the only unique part of the boss fight is when he leaves the battle for a bit and shoots a grapple gun at you, or throws blades at you, in which the fight just pauses for a bit until this stupid section is over, so even the unique aspects of this boss suck. Mundus, the big bad villain of the game, is just the savior fight from Devil May Cry 4 where he's a giant enemy who slams fists down on you and you punch those fists until he dies. Wow, epic. Oh, watch out, he's gonna shoot easily dodgeable meteors at your head. Oh no, oh dear. Bob Barbos is extremely easy. He's just a stationary target that occasionally shoots out attacks, and you have to slam the ground a few times to beat him. But the presentation is pretty solid, and the way it ties in with the story is very well done, so I can give it credit for that at least. Virgil is the only boss that stands out as he's a rival boss that has a moveset complementary to Dante's. He's fast and has a variety of quick moves that can catch you off guard, or slow charge-ups that are very punishing. He has a mix of range attacks and even has air attacks, which breaks the tedium of bosses always being grounded. Towards the end of the boss, he brings out Doppelganger, which means that you have to fight two simultaneous Virgils at once, which isn't as challenging as you'd think because they usually attack in unison, instead of with their own patterns. The Doppelganger will also stop you from landing the last blow unless you're in Devil Trigger, which is annoying and just drags the fight out more if you don't have Devil Trigger. Overall, it's a decent boss. It's not as frantic or as challenging as his DmC 3 version, but it's still a solid fight that is fast-paced, has plenty of options for the player, and brings the new idea of Doppelganger to Virgil. The problem I have with this boss is all of the cutaways. After dealing a certain amount of damage, the game will cut away to a shot of Virgil looking like he's about to tell a child to get in the van, and then... fuck's sake. And this disrupts the flow of the fight because it's constantly stopping and restarting the pace, and thus the boss never gets a good flow going, because just as you're in the zone, bam, cutscene. It was okay on my first playthrough, but on my second and third playthrough, these cutaways got annoying. So, with the exception of one, the bosses in DmC Devil May Cry are unoriginal, repetitive, and lazy, and much more should have been done to give variety and challenge. Look at the first game in the series, for example. Phantom is a spider boss where its weak point is also the most vulnerable point in which the player can be. It disrupts your movement if you stay stationary too much, it has a fireball attack for range, and it can jump around if you try and run away. Griffin focused on projectiles and range rather than melee, which requires the player to dodge intricate patterns of attacks in order to get a shot at attacking the boss. Shadow is purely melee and uses attacks that come out quick but have very clear wind-ups to allow the player to get used to the timing. Nightmare is a boss that focuses on area of effect and environmental damage. Nilo Angelo is the closest match to Dante there is, sporting a similar stature and moveset. Mundus is a big spectacle boss that focuses on big attacks that deal heavy damage but are also fairly slow. How does a game from 2001 have more variety of bosses than a 2013 game that is meant to be a reboot of that 2001 game? Huh? The level design is also a mixed bag in this game. For the most part, the levels focus on just the combat encounters and providing brief breaks in between so that the player doesn't get sick of them. These mostly include some minor automated platforming or interacting with objects. Thankfully, there aren't any sections where you have to do crappy platforming in a game that wasn't designed around it. The problem, though, is the constant interruptions in the levels with cutscenes or scripted sections. In Mission 12, for example, you spend half of the level just running around with Kat, defending her in scripted sections that you have very little input over. The problem with these scripted sections is that it severely hurts replay value, Now, I know there's some games out there that are designed to be played once and never again, but that clearly isn't the case with this game, considering all the extra difficulty modes and content you unlock. And this becomes a problem because it means the levels don't loop very well. Now, what do I mean by that? Looping level design is the idea that every second in a game actually stretches out into eternity because of how many times the level will be replayed. So for example, these scripted sections that go on for around 1 or 2 minutes will add up to several minutes or hours of wasted time on several playthroughs. And it's because there's sections that aren't utilizing the mechanics of the game and are so on rails that they will give you the exact same experience every single time you play. It hurts replayability because, every time I do the Mundus boss fight, I first have to do this scripted section that will play out the same way and thus waste my time. Same with the Bob Barboss fight. These scripted sections are fine on a first time playthrough, but the more you play the game, the more time they waste of the player, which is why, when making a character action hack and slash game with a lot of bonus unlockables and content, you should make sure there is very little interruptions in the flow of the levels. There aren't that many scripted sections in this game, but there's enough that it becomes tiring the more you replay it. When they happen, I'm mostly just sitting around waiting until I get to play the game again. I might as well just have someone else come in the room and snatch the controller away from me and then give it back to me a minute or two later, because it's basically the same effect. There's a reason why most of my favorite games are ones that feature very little scripted sections, because when I do replay them, I can just focus on having fun with the gameplay and structure instead of doing on-rail sections that I can't experiment with or change in any way, and it means I have a lot more freedom when playing the game because the pace of the game is completely up to me. That's not to say games should never feature scripted sections or that they're bad, it's just that they should be implemented in ways that make sense. There is some exploration for items and keys which unlock secret missions that level up your health bar, and these are a decent incentive to explore and look around the levels. There's also lost souls and extra orbs to collect if you do explore, which will help give you more upgrades. Overall, DmC Devil May Cry's gameplay is fairly solid. The combat has been streamlined so that it is easier to pick up and play than previous entries, but it also features far less combat variety than the previous games and fumbles the boss design. It also doesn't try to fix the balancing issues of Dante Must Die that every game in the series has had. As a standalone game, it's a solid hack and slash title. As a reboot of Devil May Cry, it's a subpar imitation. Despite the critical acclaim of its gameplay, Devil May Cry's stories have always been average at best. The games have lovable characters with entertaining personalities and character interactions, which keeps the player invested, but it's certainly no masterpiece of storytelling. Though, to be fair, DMC3's story is fairly well put together and structured. Now, when you hand the series over to a Western studio with Western writers, you're going to get a different result. For example, the character of Dante was inspired by manga and anime characters that Hideki Kamiya liked at the time, such as Cobra from Space Cobra, who has a very laid-back and calm under pressure attitude. Even his red color scheme originates from Japan, as red is typically associated with heroic figures in Japanese culture, compared to the West where red is usually associated with the opposite. Point being that Dante is a very Japanese-inspired character based on many tropes that Kamiya enjoyed. But of course, what people like can differ from culture to culture. With DMC Devil May Cry, Ninja Theory's original intention was to make a reboot that was faithful to the original games, but with a bit more edge to appeal to the Western demographic, which, as I said, you can see this in many early pieces of concept art. But since Capcom was so adamant that it be nothing like the classic games and appeal to the broadest demographic possible, they revised Dante until we got the character we have now. And frankly, I can't stand it.
Hey Bob, put a spin on this.
If you want to leave, turn your back on me, I'm powerless to stop you. But you'll be making a grave mistake. Not just for yourself, but for mankind.
For mankind?
Yes!
What makes you think I give a shit? Fucking demons.
Come on then, you little shit. Who invited you, fat ass? I'm your prom date, you ugly sack of shit.
Bob Barbers is a demon? So he's more than just a fucking dick.
It's a fucking demon. And who are you, fucknut? Get that skim bag you call an ass down here. You're an asshole!
Not only does he not look anything like the character he's based on, but he also has none of the charm or charisma of the old character. The old Dante was a goofball, someone who was always so silly in his lines, his combat, and his general devil-may-care attitude that it made him a constant joy to watch and play as. In almost every cutscene, Dante would say or do something funny,
What a big surprise. I hope for your sake you got something inside that big body of yours.
Are you the human, the son of Sparta who challenges the darkness, Mundus?
Block off, Featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way. A man with guts and honor. I like that.
Leave now, mortal! The likes of you are forbidden in this land! You who are powerless are not worthy to set foot here!
Wow, I've never seen a talking mud before. You know, in a dog show, you'd definitely take first place.
You are the human make a mockery of me?
Easy, Fido. How about I take you out for a walk? Come on, puppy. Let's go.
You'll regret this, you worm!
This party's getting crazy. Let's rock. Huh? Give me a break. Tell you what, next time I'll try and wear some cologne, okay?
You may jest, but the kindest fate I offer is to unify and spend eternity with a child of mine!
As appealing as that sounds, I think I'll pass.
You can hide that body, but that smell? Ooh, there's no covering up. Wish you would have noticed me earlier. Now my coat's all charred.
And the games constantly elevated the absurdity of his antics. Riding a motorcycle up a collapsing tower and then using it as a weapon, stacking bullets on top of each other into a katana, riding around on a rocket, performing a duet with the boss, killing demons with ricochet pool balls, catching a motorcycle mid-air with bullets and then shooting it back at Trish. And that's not even counting all the wacky stuff you can do in the game itself. Even DmC 2 ultra serious Dante still maintained this charm.
Is there a problem?
You! Is that the medallia? You sweet step?
A false coin for a false god.
Not to mention that Dante has had clear character progression over the course of the series. In Devil May Cry 3, Dante starts the game rejecting his demonic heritage, in contrast to his brother who rejects his humanity. But over the course of losing to Virgil and witnessing Lady trying to avenge her mother, thus understanding the importance of maintaining family legacy, he comes to embrace both parts of himself and takes up the role that his father once held, becoming the protector of humans from the demon world. Then, in Devil May Cry 1, he manages to avenge his mother and father by trapping Mundus in the underworld, but he also kills his brother, which makes him the last member of his family. This then leads into Devil May Cry 2, where Dante is a far more reserved and stoic person, which makes sense for his character timeline-wise. However, despite the loss he suffered, he tries to help Lucia deal with her existential crisis of being an artificial demon created to kill humans, further showing that he doesn't view demons as evil, as he was willing to trap himself in hell just so Lucia could live her life in peace. This also fits in with anime Dante, who is clearly depressed from the events of Devil May Cry 1 and is just trying to get by in life with no real end goal other than protecting humans. He's still a good guy, but the events of the games leading up to this point has taken a toll on him. Then in Devil May Cry 4, Dante takes on the mentor role to Nero and reverts back to his old goofy self, now that he knows he's not the last member of his family and someone else like him exists. However, he delivers the silly moments with a bit more maturity. Plus, Ruben Langdon's laid-back performance makes the character even more entertaining. DmC 5 released after this, so I won't talk about it. Point being that Dante was a fairly well-established character over the games, manga, and anime he's been in, so when you strip all of that away and replace his personality with a smug, vulgar, and irritatingly edgy personality, people are going to be annoyed. What makes an edgy character good is what that side of them is born from. Oftentimes it's an expression or an extension of who they are inside, and it's there to mask a deeper layer to the character that they have, on top of the character having antics so entertaining to watch that you can't help but love them. In fact, Kamiya has gone on record as saying that this is why the original Dante acts like a goofball. Deep down he's actually angry or straight up afraid of the demons he faces, but he doesn't want them to see that side of him, so he buries it under a charming attitude, giving him the strength to carry on. This Dante doesn't have any of that. This Dante doesn't have a deeper layer to his character that he tries to bury under the persona of being a cool guy. He's just tiresome. Most of his lines are just swearing instead of charming one-liners to fit the situation. I have no problem with profanity, I swear all the time, but when it comes to writing Dante, please be a bit more creative. He's also extremely rude to everyone he comes across for no reason. Now, I wouldn't mind Dante being a jerk if the character interactions with him were entertaining to watch or funny. After all, there's a lot of popular characters who are jerks or even terrible people, but how they handle the situations they find themselves in is what makes them entertaining. But most of the cutscenes are just Dante talking to another character, saying bad dialogue, or asking what the next objective is, or making irritating jokes.
Just be careful. You can get rough in there.
I like it rough.
He never gets up to any crazy antics apart from putting his clothes on in the trailer whilst it's moving, which is right at the start of the game. After that, he never does any wacky stuff ever again. His character arc is meant to be him growing to be the protector of mankind and a more mature person, but by the end of the game he's still acting like an immature brat. He's irritating to listen to, he's boring as hell to watch, and it's hard to grow attached to a character who is insufferable at every opportunity. Another change they made which was unnecessary is that in this version of Devil May Cry, Ava was an angel instead of a human, which would make Dante half angel, half demon. And this is a stupid change, and the reason it's stupid is because it goes against one of the original intentions Kamiya had with the character. Kamiya considers Dante's humanity as his defining character trait. In fact, it's a defining character trait in every single one of his protagonists. He creates these inspiring heroes that always have the best interests of humans at the forefront of their mind. All of his protagonists are human in some way. Sure, some of them may have godlike powers, but they're still flesh and blood like you and me, which helps keep them relatable despite their crazy status. Removing Dante's humanity removes any shred of relatability the character may have had, and it just further disconnects the character from the player. This version of Dante is unlikable and a pale imitation of a beloved character. By trying to make him edgy and cool, they removed everything that made Dante fun to begin with. And once again, I'll go back to Kamiya. Kamiya never writes his characters to be cool. He writes them to be fun. It's just that fun characters can end up being cool ones too, like Dante. He made Dante with the intention of creating a character that you could share a drink with at the bar. Tamim Antoniades, sorry if I mispronounced that by the way, looked to the wrong inspirations for Dante. Could many of these ideas work with an original character? Sure. But when you're rebooting a series with the intention of replacing a character that many love, they are going to draw comparisons, and when you rip out everything they love and replace it with worse characterization, it's no wonder people hate your game. But okay, what about the other characters? Virgil in this version is the leader of an underground group called the Order. Are you kidding me? That's the best you can come up with. The Order. The Order is fighting against Mundus and his control on society through capitalism and misrepresented news, using demonic power to influence stock markets, the news, and politicians. Dante and Virgil's dynamic is quite different in this game. Instead of rivals, they work together to take down Mundus and his minions, and we get to see some of their childhood explored, which is something the main series hadn't really done up to this point. They still clash over plans and ideals, but they still have that brotherly love for one another. My problem is that this removes a lot of personal goals and characterization from Virgil. In Devil May Cry 3, Virgil wanted to obtain the power of Sparda as he rejected his human side for being weak, but his lust for power became his downfall, leading to him losing the battle to Mundus and becoming mind-controlled to fight Dante. This was a personal conflict that was built up between Dante and Virgil for the entire game of Devil May Cry 3. Dante originally just wants to fight Virgil because he hates him, but by the end of the game, he's fighting him to protect the human world, and he eventually grows to love his brother despite the circumstances. After beating Mundus, Virgil then declares that he and Dante should take his place. Dante rejects the idea of controlling humans, but Virgil states that he's not going to be a dictator. Instead, he'll be more of a protector, to stop humans from getting too out of control. And honestly, I'm with Virgil on this one. Humans are unpredictable and dangerous even to ourselves. So it makes sense that if you really care about this world and its inhabitants, that you would look over them. But Dante still disagrees and they fight. If this was Virgil's plan all along, why wouldn't he have said this to Dante and Kat? When he says it at the end, he's genuinely surprised that Dante and Kat aren't on board. Did he just expect them to be, or was he planning to betray them? Plus, I'm not convinced Virgil could protect the human world. He almost always needs Dante's help to save him in this game. It's a rushed betrayal just so Virgil can be the final boss and so Dante and Virgil could have the rivalry they had in Devil May Cry 3, but with way less legs to stand on. Dante and Virgil's rivalry was well established, and the one time when they worked together made sense because they both had a vested interest. Here it just comes out of the blue and it makes this Virgil look incompetent, as he needs Dante to fulfill his plans the whole game, but then can't even stand his ground against his brother, which not only removes him of any agency, but also just makes his relationship with his brother weaker than what the classic games offered. Not to mention that he commits sniper abortion on Lilith, the one who carries Mundus' child. He first shoots her in the stomach, lets her take a second to realize that he's just killed her baby, and then shoots her in the head.
The fuck?
My thoughts exactly, Dante. What was the purpose of doing this? The cat is just nothing. I really can't name a defining character trait about her here. Her reasons for being involved with Virgil is that her foster father, who was a demon, abused her, and it led to her ending up in limbo where Virgil saved her, and as such she joined him. Her relationship with Dante is very weak. She's meant to be the one who brings Dante's humanity out, similar to the lady in Devil May Cry 3, but the two don't share much in common, and instead of being a badass gun-wielding chick, she's a damsel in distress for most of the story. Even Trish in Devil May Cry 1 had a more defined personality and even had a small character arc, going from being a manipulative assassin to a caring friend. Kat has nothing to make her stand out. Mundus is a terrible villain and a massive downgrade. In Devil May Cry 1, Mundus was an ominous presence that watched you for the entire game and sent his minions out to fight you because he deemed you too small of a threat to deal with himself. And when his minions did fail to kill you, he punished them harshly, portraying him as a powerful force to be reckoned with, and that comes to a climax with his boss fight, where you fight him in infinite space and use the power of Sparta to defeat him. In the reboot, he's a bald rich guy who has sex with his mistress so hard that her face falls off, and anytime Dante beats his minions, he either freaks out or says a stupid line.
Me, a god, versus you, a piece of shit.
He's not intimidating or interesting, he's just a boring villain. Bob Barbas is a parody of Bill O'Reilly, and he's honestly my favorite character in the whole game with how much he hams up the performance. It's a really good satirical take on news outlets that lie to the public for political or financial reasons. He's not even trying to be subtle, and that just makes his misrepresentations of the stories he covers all that much more funnier to watch.
Police have released footage of the terrorist responsible for the recent attacks at St. Agrius' church. He goes by the name of Dante. Remember his face, people. If you see him, inform the police immediately, but do not approach him. He has a history of physical violence and is a known sexual deviant. This is Bob Barbas, just doing God's work.
Sparta is now just some loser instead of a badass warrior who fought against demons to protect the human world, and Eva is barely mentioned here, so I can't really talk about her. And yeah, that's about it for the characters. They're all unlikable, they have no defining personality traits, they say terrible dialogue, and they make the story of this game a chore to get through. The plot itself is nothing special. It's a simple story about a group of people rising up to take down the evil big bad guy, which is fine, not every plot needs to be complex, but when the characters are as bad as they are presented here, it makes the story fall flat on its face. And the characters are the most important aspect of a DmC game. They influence the gameplay mechanics, and they are what make the cutscenes and story fun to watch. I really couldn't care less for the game's political messages, or its Gothic City art style, or its eye vomit color palette, because the parts of Devil May Cry that I, and most people care about, are handled poorly. Instead of making me grow attached to this newer take on the characters, all it did was make me pray for the day the old ones would return. And thankfully, my prayers were answered. 2 months after the game released, a DLC named Virgil's Downfall was released, which continues the story from the main game and adds Virgil as a playable character. Unlike his DmC3 Special Edition version, Virgil only has one weapon this time: Yamato. A character only having one weapon isn't a bad thing. Nero only has Red Queen, for example. However, just like Dante, this means that a lot of those moves had to be moved to another weapon, in this case Yamato. Starfall and Lunar Phase are moved to the Angel mode, and Helmbreaker is moved to the Demon mode. However, moves such as Round Trip are completely gone. To compensate for the lack of lock-on, Ninja Theory added Summon Swords. Virgil will fire a sword into an enemy, and that forms a connection between him and the enemy itself so that he can teleport to them. It has a tendency to fire at the target you don't want it to, and it just further demonstrates that removing lock-on was a bad idea. Otherwise though, he is faster than Dante, and as such it means you can play the game at a much faster pace than you usually could, which is fun. In terms of enemies and bosses, they're all reused from the main game, and the one actual boss fight the DLC has is just Virgil again. For the last mission, you get Doppelganger, which sends out a summon of Virgil that copies your moves. This can be used in a lot of creative ways, but why is it only given to you in the last mission? I get replayability and all, but it seems odd to introduce a major gameplay mechanic at the end of a DLC, where you will barely get to use it. Story-wise, this DLC has Virgil go into the underworld and face hallucinations of Kat, Dante, and Eva, before then killing an alternate version of himself, gaining power, and then sending a demon army to take over the human world. Yeah, Virgil didn't take losing to Dante well, and this DLC just makes him seem like even more of a total loser, instead of the badass rival we all know and love. Honestly, none of this matters since classic DmC has returned, so I personally believe that this version of Virgil actually went insane and killed Kat and Dante, and then took over the world, because I think it's funny. In terms of bonus content, Bloody Palace was added shortly after launch, and it is pretty fun to play the game without the story constantly getting in the way. The stages increase in difficulty, and you get to fight the bosses from the main game. There's alternate costumes and extra difficulty modes too, but like I said, the balancing for the game is a bit awful. In the Definitive Edition, they added 2 new costumes for Virgil and Dante based on their classic iterations, and they also added Turbo Mode. Turbo Mode, of course, makes the game play at 20% extra speed, which is my preferred way of playing. They also added a new mode which I quite like and I wish was in Devil May Cry 5, called Must Style Mode. Must Style is a mode where you only deal damage to enemies as long as you have an S rank, and it's actually a pretty entertaining challenge. However, as I said in my Devil May Cry 4 video, it is quite odd that they added more content to a complete game than an incomplete game, even though these re-releases came out around the same time. But hey, at least DmC Devil May Cry is a complete game, unlike DmC 4. Soundtrack-wise, I'm mixed. There's a lot of punk rock inspired tracks that are high adrenaline and get the blood pumping during gameplay. But then there's also this wubby dubstep music that is like nails on chalkboard. There really wasn't any track in particular that stuck out to me apart from Gotta Go. And Empty. Otherwise, the rest of the music blends together. In the original games, every track had a unique rhythm or use of instruments or lyrics or tone to stand out, especially the boss themes. Here, they all just blend together. The soundtrack's fine, but it's nothing compared to the previous games. Even Devil May Cry 2 has a more memorable soundtrack. In the end, DmC Devil May Cry really is a product of its time. A time when Capcom was losing its way with many franchises, when they started to move away from what made their franchises so beloved to begin with, only to disappoint everyone. Resident Evil 6, Lost Planet 3, Dead Rising 4, and DmC Devil May Cry were all victims of Capcom shooting themselves in the foot, caring more about reaching a broader audience and making money than making a great game that will sell based on the fact that it's a great game. Capcom still does scummy business practices today, but at least they publish quality games nowadays, so it does soften the blow a bit, and classic Devil May Cry has returned to its former glory. But it's still ridiculous that we even got to this state. If Capcom did not rush Devil May Cry 4 out the door, then it would have been a better game and likely would have sold better as a result. If Capcom didn't force Ninja Theory to make a game completely unlike the classic series instead of a fateful reboot, then we would have gotten a better game. DmC Devil May Cry by itself is a fun game with entertaining gameplay that contains more depth, complexity, and player expression than a lot of hack-and-slash games in the Western market. But it also, unfortunately, has a weak story and terrible depictions of beloved characters. In some ways, I do feel bad for Ninja Theory, but they certainly didn't help themselves with the controversy at the time. If they had handled it better, I would likely be more sympathetic towards the game and the developers. As it stands, DmC is a showcase of what happens when a company doesn't realize the value their product has, and tries to reinvent the product instead of improving upon its flaws, resulting in a situation that nobody wanted. I can safely say that I'm happy that the Devil May Cry I love and grew up with came back. You know, I'm amazed I got through this whole video without once mentioning the stupid white wig joke.